Dr. Magalie Masamba, thank you very much for joining us here for the Happy Smart City podcast. It's been a long time coming. I know people are busy. I know you're traveling between countries, and certainly a very hectic time considering the world today. And I'd just like to say, we should have our sisters and brothers in India in our prayers for today's session. They're having a very difficult time with the COVID situation there. But thank you very much for joining us. It's an absolute honor to have you.
Thank you for having me. It's such a great opportunity to be able to share my thoughts, and my heart does go out to our brothers and sisters in India.
Yeah, and before we get into your questions, I'd just like to say that, you're sitting in a very important position where, everyone is talking theory on how foreign direct investment capital flows, can be accelerated onto the African continent or perhaps other frontier and emerging markets. But we all know nothing really happens by the book, and there's all these nuances and intricacies that are very unique to certain regions, and your insights are very critical because this is not just an intellectual exercise. This is reality and how people should invest in the region. So my first question for you is, what is your current occupation?
Thank you for that question. I'm a lawyer by training. Mainly, my career has focused on law and policy, really. So, on one hand, I'm a law and policy advisor. On the other hand, I'm also a researcher. I've been working in the field of international development and international economic law for close to 9 years, I guess. And I've worked for a broad array of clients, including African governments, international organizations, tertiary institutions, NGOs, and the private sector. So that's given me a pretty interesting view of things. So just to break down, my advisory work has focused on different aspects, private sector development, infrastructure development, and by that I mean, how do we build resilient infrastructure, infrastructure finance, and people first PPPs, as well as investment promotion, protection, investment dispute resolution. And the research component of my work, which has mainly focused on debt management and restructuring, has mainly been through my doctoral studies. So I did a Doctor of Law degree, and I focused on sovereign debt restructuring at the University of Pretoria, and I'm currently doing a postdoctoral fellowship at the University of Pretoria and Boston University's Global Development Policy Center, and I'm focusing on debt. So it's a bit of a mouthful. So I'm basically working in international development, and I'm an advocate of the High Court of Zanzibar in Tanzania, a senior fellow of the African Sovereign Debt Justice Network. So I'm doing quite a lot that is both academic and in the field.
So sounds like you're doing exactly what needs to be done right now. So congratulations. Congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay. So moving on, how does your profession contribute to the economies of cities?
It's a very interesting question. So, as I mentioned, I work in the field of international development, and I specifically focus on Africa's development. So I can say that when one has a career in international development, the core, whether you're a lawyer like myself, or whether you work in the field as an economist, a financial advisor, or you work on governance issues, the core is that we aim at improving livelihoods. So we're trying to, international development is really about improving the quality of people's lives. And in this case, my work has directly related to improving cities because I've been working on infrastructure development, both social infrastructure and infrastructure that supports economic activities. So this is literally improving African cities, as well as also working on the regulatory and policy aspect, which has involved legislative reform and policy reform that incorporates sustainable development, environmental protection, and human rights. on the continent. So I guess in a way, it's an easy question. My career, or at least my field, directly impacts the development of African cities, I can say.
Right, right. So really, really just focusing on policy for welfare in these cities.
Well, not really just policy for welfare per
Mm-hmm.
se, which is an
Mm-hmm.
important aspect, but more so policy on how these cities run. So I'll give
Okay.
one example. For example, when I worked on public-private partnerships in Tanzania, I did two things. I was involved in the legislative reform. How do we identify public-private partnership projects? How do we prepare for these projects? How do we finance these projects, and so forth? And then I was involved in the actual projects themselves, which involve, for example, selection of projects, project preparation, and so forth. So it's I think it's more than just welfare, and I'm using I'm interpreting welfare in the traditional sense. It's
Yeah, I,
really
I
just
was
about,
just about to say. I was just about to say.
yeah.
I think I used a blanket statement. So
Yeah.
apologies on that. I do know you've been in the trenches, though. I know.
Yes.
Yes, yes, yes.
Yeah.
Apologies.
So maybe instead of welfare, we can say well-being, maybe.
I'll take that.
Development. I don't know. Yeah.
For economic development. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. That sounds really good. That sounds really good.
Okay. So, in your opinion, Dr. Masamba, what is the role of law in the economic disciplines of management, finance, and investment?
Thank you. That's a really interesting question, actually. I have had the opportunity to be involved in quite a number of these fields that you've mentioned: finance, economics, management, business, and so forth. For the lack of a better word, I'll just lump these sectors up and call them industry. So I've been involved in industry. And so to answer your question, I'll speak about two things. So the first one is going to be how these fields, that's industry and law, interact, and the fact that they're interdependent. So, on my first point on interaction, to me, your question is kind of synonymous with sub questions. For example, what is the role of the law in economic development? A second one could be, what is the role of law in promoting ease of doing business? Another one could be, for example, what is the role of law in promoting responsible and sustainable investment? Or what is the role of the law in enhancing responsible financial management? So when you ask the question that way, it kind of seems a little bit more clear what the role of the law is, because when you consider those sub questions, a few things might pop in your head, and they did when you first asked the question. So for me, the first one is that the law promotes certainty and predictability. So here I'm thinking more of from an investment perspective, for example, where investors know the rules and know what's expected and so forth. A second point that comes to my mind is regulation and supervision of sectors to ensure that there's the right checks and balances. And here I'm thinking, for instance, the banking sector or the financial sector more broadly. Um, the law also provides a protection mechanism. So here we're thinking of the rule of law and protecting, for example, property rights and contractual rights, which is quite a fundamental requirement for any legal regime. Another idea that comes to my mind is the fact that the law may be a mechanism to prevent misconduct in these fields. Um, and here, of course, we should also acknowledge the role that is held by those that are primarily responsible for implementing the law. So, without good implementers, such as the judiciary and so forth, the law just becomes a piece of paper, even if you have a very, very well written statute or regulation or rule. So, here in general, to me, the law in effect acts as both the carrot. which relates to the fact that it provides the good things we need to promote business and investment and economic growth, um, such as the right incentives to attract investment. But on the other hand, it also acts as a stick, especially when there's the issue of misconduct. So it's kind of like a double-edged sword. Um, so but I guess maybe to conclude the issue of the role of the law, it might be important to note that this only works when you have laws or legal system and an institutional system that is we have clear laws. These laws are public, they are fair, they can be effectively enforced, and they apply equally across the population. So they're non-discriminatory. So that's on the first point. And on the second point of interdependence between industry, which are the different fields you've mentioned, and the law, is really that the law and industry, they're not really mutually exclusive fields. One won't really exist without the other if you're talking about economic development. Yeah, so that's about it on my view on the role of the law and the economic disciplines.
Mm, mm. Yeah, yeah, yeah. I like that. I like that. So I'm gonna just before we move on to the next one, the reason I asked
Yeah.
this question is because of some of the things that we had discussed, and later questions will address that too. But I'd just like to be very explicit and very clear on this one. What do you think is is the cause for foreign investors, being reluctant to invest in regions like Africa? I know some capital markets are very developed. I know, the rule of law is very well established. But considering that, these are UN member countries that we have here,
Yeah.
what are some of the most distinct challenges that we see in enforcing the law as far as protecting foreign investors?
Mm. It's a really, really good question. And I think it's a question that not many people ask. They always take at face value that certain regions might be seen as more riskier than others. Africa is a very interesting case. So before I speak about enforcement, I'm going to speak about the fact that it's such a paradox. We have such a wealth of natural resources, and there's a clear opportunity for investment. But at the same time, it's one of the riskiest regions to invest in. And of course, I must put a disclaimer that, of course, we have more than 50 African countries. Each is different, each is unique, and each has challenges and opportunities of its own. So for some countries, the issue is really just safety and security, for example. So that's a pretty easy one. So an example is, my country, the Democratic Republic of Congo, which is probably one of the most interesting investment destinations, but is also relatively volatile, to say the least. So, of course, peace and security. Another thing that comes to my mind is really just about the institutions and how they're managed, and not only that, but laws, transparency, of course, is the issue of corruption, which, of course, these issues are not necessarily unique to Africa, but they might be a little bit more pronounced in the region. Now, when it comes to the laws and enforcement, I guess if I was an investor, one thing I would be thinking about is enforcement of contracts, which I had already mentioned, and even just transparency, independence of the judiciary, and so forth. And there's different ways of getting around these issues. So, for example, investors might opt when it comes to dispute resolution for the use of international arbitration as a dispute resolution body, as opposed to, I don't know, going to, the high court of a certain country because they're worried about independence of the judiciary. So yeah, so in as much as Africa's a riskier region, I guess it's also a region where you can make quite a lot. Like I said, we have natural resources, we have a very large young population and so forth. So, yeah, hopefully that kind of sheds light on your question, and I hope we'll delve more into it when we speak further on the other
Right.
questions.
All right. I like that answer very much. More than satisfactory.
Great.
And then, what is the role of public-private partnerships in economic development, and what success cases and failures can you share? Why do some succeed and others fail?
Okay. Well, I love talking about PPPs, probably because I've been working on them for quite a while. So let's start from the beginning. What are we talking about when we're talking about PPPs, the three Ps or public-private partnerships? So here I'll take a definition from the World Bank that I just pulled off the PPP knowledge, their PPP knowledge lab, and the World Bank defines a PPP as a long-term contract between the private party and a government entity for the provision of a public asset or service in which the private party bears significant risk and management responsibility, and remuneration is linked to performance. So in developing countries, a major motivation for the use of PPPs, which comes from the key component of the fact that that the private partner bears major risk, is the transference of financial risk. So depending on the nature of the project, of course. So here, African governments are quite attracted to the idea of PPPs because you can transfer financial risk, you can transfer construction risk and management risk. And since PPPs allocate risk to the party that is best able to bear it, there are various, motivations, I could say, or advantages, which is, for instance, leveraging private sector efficiency and innovation. This is through transferring your design risk, your construction risk, your management risk of a facility, for example. Or it could be to free up public resources through the transfer of the financial risk that I've just mentioned. So these are just two examples. But before kind of delving deeper into your question, I always love making this disclaimer, or at least pointing out some misconceptions that kind of influences the success of projects. So the first one is the fact that not all projects should be pursued using PPPs, which is technically speaking a way of procuring a project. So not all projects should be pursued using PPP model. A second one that comes to my mind is the fact that the PPP method of procurement doesn't make a bad project good. It's a method of procurement. So from the onset, you need to have a good project. And another one, and a very important one that comes to my mind, is the fact that PPPs don't offer free money. They don't offer free money. So you do need to have a project that that can guarantee return of investment. And finally, the use of PPPs as a method of procurement does not guarantee that a project is going to be successful. So, of course, there's pros and cons of the use of PPPs, and they can be very good if implemented with the right economic conditions. But they can also fail and be bad when those certain conditions are not in place. So here, what am I speaking about? And of course, this is not like an exhaustive list, but it's like a few things that I have come to my mind as I've been working on, especially project preparation and I guess selection, identification, and preparation. So an important one is, which you can allude from my previous statement, is the fact that projects need to demonstrate value for money. So, and here they need to demonstrate value for money with respect to procurement through PPPs versus traditional procurement. So you need to say, hey, this is a great project. It will guarantee value for money, and the best way of value for money is through PPP specifically. A second point is that there has to be political will at the highest level of government. So, of course, without political will a project will fail. A third point is that there has to be a high level of market interest, and there has to be capacity of the private market to actually deliver that specific project. So, PPPs are quite expensive to prepare. The tender process could be relatively more onerous. So you need to ensure that there is actually market interest. There has to be a broader enabling environment. So your public-private partnership project won't exist in a silo, but is going to be linked to many other systems. So, for instance, you're going to need approval. So here I'm looking at the legal system broadly, even contractual management, the procurement system, legal enforcement, land acquisition regimes, and so forth, just to mention a few. The business environment in general needs to also kind of facilitate a process. An important one to me, and I guess to a lot of the international institutions and even African governments, should and is stakeholder engagement. So when I'm thinking of stakeholder engagement, I'm thinking of engagement of different stakeholders within the government to facilitate the process, such as approvals and so forth. I'm thinking of stakeholder engagements of the primary stakeholder, who are the consumers. And here, just speaking to the consumers to see if they actually really want that project, for example, and getting their input in the project and determining affordability, depending on how you're going to fund the project. Whether it's going to come from, I don't know, availability payments from the government or payments directly from consumers if the project is a concession. And yeah, so I've mentioned determining affordability, stakeholder engagement, and a very, very important one, which really relates to the new era in which we're doing business, we're investing, and we're building infrastructure, which is the consideration of environmental and social safeguards. So those are kind of the conditions that can help make projects successful. And of course, the role of the government here, as institutions like the World Bank have noted, is really just demonstrate you have political will, create technical teams that are well equipped to manage such a complex process and projects, and also just in institutions and ensuring this governance of a project. The final section of your question, if I remember correctly, is the fact that you've asked me about projects and examples. And I must admit that a lot of the projects I've been working on, and especially because these projects are generally long term, so you'd work on a specific component of a project. And so you wouldn't really see a project through, especially if, this project is, I don't know, 25 years, 30 years, you might come in the middle. But a lot of the projects I've specifically personally worked on, I've kind of started at the very, very beginning. And I guess projects can fail or succeed at different stages. So let's look at project identification, for example. Projects can fail right there. So I've helped government teams in identification of projects in my different roles. And I've sat in workshops and we've thought about what could be a good project in a particular local government authority and so forth. And so just starting from there, projects can fail. And I've seen challenges in project preparation. Of course, a lot of these projects, I can't really mention them by name, and especially for those that have not reached completion yet. So, there's challenges in project preparation, which is how do you manage the temptation to speed up preparation, for example, not conducting a full feasibility study, or ignoring certain aspects because you really, really want to get a project out there, you want to get it to tender for any reason, whether it's, I don't know, electoral cycle coming up and so forth. So I've kind of seen those kinds of project failing, the unnamed ones that will never really go into the books because they failed really early. But of course, there's a lot of case studies that have been conducted on different African projects. And I'll just name one that is pretty close to home since I'm based in Pretoria, which is, for example, the construction of the Department of Trade and Industry building in Pretoria, the DTI. That was a PPP. I think it was completed in 2004. And I think it's interesting one because while the South African market is quite advanced, and is probably one of the longest players in the industry, this was actually the first time that government accommodation or government buildings were developed using a PPP. And so here the government developed 7 low-rise buildings, and I guess, I don't know, 43,000 square meters of office space with a basement and parking. And the project cost was 505 million rands. And I would have to think through again about the length of the contract, but this is quite an interesting one because it demonstrates the different kinds of projects you can have. So it's not just your usual ones, your toll roads, or your hydro, or your, I don't know, hydro or solar power plants. It could also be a government building. But of course, here, the challenge for this kind of a project would be the fact that you fund it through an availability payment, which is, the private sector gets paid when the building is well constructed, is running well, during the operation and maintenance phase, and so forth. So there always has to be something in the government budget for that payment. Another project that kind of comes to my mind is the Leki Expressway. It's a toll road in Nigeria. And this project is quite an interesting one because, on paper, it looks like quite a good project and quite an important one, a toll road, but the project faced quite a number of challenges, and I'm not sure whether it's still facing those challenges today, but very early on, this project demonstrated issues with stakeholder consultations, and this is really consulting the users of that toll road. And if I remember correctly, there were also issues with a competing road.
I'm gonna interject right there because
Please do.
We've had so many cases of these toll roads, just like with the South African ones, right? The e-toll system. They really had very, very little interaction with the users before all of that was implemented.
Yeah, and that's a big issue, and that kind of speaks back to project preparation. And in fact, in theory, the best approach would be setting up meetings with the community very early on from the inception, and maybe the issue here really is that sometimes there's a perception that the government knows what's best for its people. And of course it could, and in theory that could be correct. But when it comes to projects that are going to be, for instance, funded by the people, the users, there's so many considerations that you need to make, and you can't make an effective financial assessment without interaction with the users. So for example, if you have 2 roads, one is relatively longer, but people don't have to pay, a toll. You do need to speak to the users to see would they be interested in paying a little bit more to reduce their travel time. And sometimes it's not really about asking them, but also having discussions with them to help them understand the logic. And I've worked on some smaller projects as well, like markets, where I was involved in community engagement, where after a lot of discussions with traders, for example, they understood why it's benefit to pay a little bit more and have a slightly bigger stall, or or a more organized market that could encourage more users.
Right.
So you're making a really, really good point, and I hope that what I would call people first PPPs, which is our PPPs of the future, are going to have more stakeholder engagement and also, in effect, have better financial models and guarantee value for money.
Yeah. And one, as you were speaking, about the PPPs and all of the minutiae of the PPP, one thing that I was thinking of in terms of institutional coordination and creating economic resilience is special economic zones, because they, especially in Africa, where geography is such a huge part of the economy,
Yes.
because we're so endowed with natural resources, we're not a service economy. The region really would benefit from special economic zones that would help maximize the geographical policies, but then still, benefit from certain government systems, but again, detach itself because of the unique location. And then I want to move on to the next one here, which is, how can sovereign debt be leveraged positively to create broad-based prosperity and equity in a country?
Thank you for that. And also thank you for pointing out the potential of special economic zones. That's a topic I did quite a lot of research on during my master's and wrote my thesis on it. And it's something I'm always interested to chat about. So let's talk about debt, the big dirty word that nobody really likes talking about, especially governments. So there's a misconception generally that debt is bad. Debt is not bad. Debt is a good thing. And it's an important tool for the development of any country. What is bad, however, is debt mismanagement, corruption, and so forth. So, to answer your question quite from the onset, debt can be used, or debt finance can be used to develop infrastructure and to really just support economic activity. So, when do we start having challenges with debt? So, to me, the important thing is, what is the level of debt that you're accumulating, and how do you plan to repay it, and what are you using it for? And what are the mechanisms have you developed for checks and balances? So here I'm thinking more of, do we have a system that is transparent on how debt is accrued? And one thing that comes just to the top of my mind is, this the infamous Mozambican secret debt fiasco that happened a few years ago, where the country accrued debt, and this didn't go through the parliamentary process. So you need to have a transparent process that has checks and balances. But not only that, the question is, what are you using your debt for? Are you using it to pay government official salaries, for example? Or do you have a specific project that is well prepared, can guarantee value for money, and so forth? And of course, there's the question of debt sustainability, or the debt levels, and keeping those within check. So just in summary, debt is not a bad thing. Debt is a good thing. It's an important tool that can be used to finance infrastructure, economic activity. The challenge is, how do you accrue it? And is there transparency? The other challenge is the levels of debt, and what do you use it for?
And if I could just come in here to close off on the debt. So I'm also just wary sometimes of why people, or at least nations, don't time interest rates properly. And I think, again, it's all about political cycles. But at the end of the day, if you're following and monitoring interest rates in the EU, and in the United States, or even the pound sterling, you could do really well with leveraged finance if you follow interest rates well. But I'm not a sovereign debt a fanatic so much. I haven't really been following contracts and what they're looking like as far as interest rates are concerned. but I always have the feeling that, global interest rates are never really at the center of some of the debt that takes place in Africa,
Yeah.
because most projects really do not succeed. And very often, the interest rates are massive if you think about the amount of money that is
Yes.
being borrowed. Now, next question is, considering that legislation takes long to pass through Parliament, and this is something that you educated me on in our previous communication, considering that legislation takes long to pass through Parliament, how can various institutions be coordinated to interpret laws innovatively for a more equitable society?
That's a tough one, and I'll use the broad interpretation of interpret. Because when you say interpretation of laws to a lawyer, they immediately think of the judiciary. But I understand we're using interpretation in just a general sense. This is a tough one. It's even a tough one for me to answer because it is true. Legislative reform is not easy. When we talk about changing an act, and in some communities, in some areas of law, the law is kind of being left behind. So you have technological advancements and so forth, and the law is being left behind. And the question is, what do we do when the law is being left behind? And of course, every country should have an effective law reform commission, and also the community should play an active role in trying to encourage legislative reform as much as they can. But that's a difficult one, and I think in the absence of hard written laws, there is room for institutions through their internal policies, not really to change the law, I guess, but to kind of enforce it in a way that it meets the times. But I don't think anybody has an answer for this one. I would be interested to have this discussion with, colleagues and friends in the legal field. And I guess, I hope this question will pop up again when you're talking to your next interviewee who has a legal background, because I'd be very curious to know somebody else's opinion, because it is something I've experienced in the field. So, for example, I worked in one jurisdiction where the dispute resolution laws were literally more than 100 years old. And the idea that there needed to be a legislative amendment is complicated. It's not something that happens overnight. But investors were very interested in this region, and their biggest question was, how do we resolve disputes with a law and arbitration act that is old and that was basically almost copied and pasted from a colonial time? And here, one of the solutions that we came up with was a contractual solution, where, of course, in line with the law, but the contract gave flexibility on dispute resolution, and we use the dispute resolution rules of a certain body. So there are ways you can get around it. So it really depends on the scenario.
Okay. And so, in your opinion, how can blockchain be leveraged for transparency and accountability and public administration and state-owned enterprises?
Thank you. That's a very interesting one as well. And of course, I'll make a disclaimer. I'm not a tech person. I haven't worked with blockchain. However, I do have an opinion on it, partly because I've worked with the public sector and I've worked in the public sector as a government employee. And one of the main challenges I had was, personally, was data management. And you would always hear that, oh, this piece of work was done 10 years ago, but nobody has a copy of it, because, I don't know, somebody was using Gmail accounts, the person has left, there's been a change in government, and so forth. And so access to information and data is a big issue. And I'm just thinking about the fact that imagine trying to access documents 20 years from now, 30 years from now. And I loved your statement when you said you've been in the trenches, because literally I've been in the trenches. from trying to help my colleagues on basic things like, saving documents, how are we going to do document management. And a lot of governments, African governments, are trying to incorporate an e-filing system. And that's great. We do need to digitize and improve and even scan documents. But blockchain, I think, presents a very interesting way of ensuring data management, transparency, and even information protection in the long term. So I don't know. Are we ready for it? I don't know. I don't know if African governments are ready for this. I guess maybe I'm speaking. I'm throwing a blanket over everyone because, like we mentioned before, there's over 50 different countries, and so we can't compare. I don't know, South Africa, with maybe another country. But I'm just thinking more generally and not looking at the more advanced economies in the region. I'm looking at the countries that are even having challenges digitizing, but it presents an interesting prospect to have transparency, access to information, and even to protect data better than, I don't know, sending emails around of confidential information. And I think that the fact that we may not be ready in general shouldn't be a reason why African countries should not explore these, even as they deal with the basic issues like, I don't know, internet access, and having computers in government offices that work and having stable electricity. We should be thinking about digitization. We should be talking about it, and we should definitely be exploring it, because that's the future.
Well, I'll just say one thing on my end. Any country that's got internet connection, to me, should try its best to get on the blockchain. And one thing that I like about it is because when you implement it on the cloud, you'll never have issues of national data centers being burnt down.
Yes,
thing
that's a good point.
Exactly. So you could actually pick a country where the cloud or the data sovereignty policies are really, really strong in order for this system to be more superior, for government to be more resilient than politics.
Yes. And of course, there's that little question of security.
Exactly.
That would have to master. But this is literally the future. This is what would make us more efficient.
Exactly.
So I really like this question.
Exactly. Now, our last question, which will really, really, be much more of an opinion from your side, and what we're all about here at the Happy Smart City Forum and why we have the podcast is: what elements of smart cities should local governments focus on to allow for happier and more fulfilling cities?
That's a really good question, a very interesting one. It reminds me of a quote that I recently saw, and it's a pity I can't tell you the source, but it said something to the fact that the primary drivers of economic development and prosperity in society are cities. So cities are important, and how we design them, manage them is also very important. So a few things come to my mind, but before I discuss what I think LGAs or local government should focus on when it comes to making their cities happier, is I should mention the fact that I guess there's no one size fit all formula for creating a happy city. And in fact, just happiness is quite a subjective thing. And I guess for each government authority, they're going to take a different approach, whether it's within a certain country.
Happiness is free ice cream for everyone every day.
Exactly. So some things are very important for other cities when they're not important for others. So an example, for a long time I lived in Stone Town, which is part of Zanzibar Town, and there a very important issue was really protection of the
culture and also historical heritage. So I literally lived on a historical site. And this could be, different for, another city that is by the coast and, and they value different things. But while there's these subjective features, there's also the objective ones that would, to me, make any city happier, at least in my opinion. So here I'm thinking of the provision of basic utilities. And here I'm specifically thinking about clean, affordable, accessible energy. And I'm thinking about access to clean, reliable water and other utilities like waste management, sanitation. So, if I was working in the local government, I would really be focusing on utilities. Another aspect is really about how do we improve the use of the space. And I'm thinking of the residential space, the workspace, and the play space. You said, happiness is free ice cream for everyone. There has to be that sweet aspect. How do we connect our city by building roads? And how do we create green spaces, for example, which is something, that anybody would value from a young age to an older age. Another important one is, which I feel like is usually not discussed when we talk about happy cities, is the happy city for all. So how do we create a happy city for all, especially more vulnerable groups? And here I'm talking about women, the elderly, and people with special needs. And how do we incorporate them in the design and management of a city? So sometimes you have a city that's great, but maybe the public transport system doesn't make it comfortable for women, for example, because it's not safe enough. Or maybe, you don't have facilities for people who are hearing impaired or have sight issues or even the elderly. So I just really believe in leaving no man behind. And so it's not just happy city, but happy for all. Of course, you can't please everyone, but I guess you understand the context I'm speaking on. And I guess the last point, which kind of links to our discussion on blockchain, is really about the digital divide and kind of narrowing that gap. Because, we are in a modern economy, and I'm thinking of telecoms and internet access and communication, So here is, how do we create a city that kind of, narrows the digital divide and gives access to all to something that I think is so important, like internet access, for example. That almost has become like a human right in a way.
Exactly, exactly. And when you do mention human rights did come to my mind as you were talking about women and children.
Fantastic.
Because it kind of seems like in the design thinking of a city, you have to bake in the issues of human rights. And today we've got the SDGs and all these issues around equity. So I think the design thinking for the morphology of cities, whether it's in revamping them or expanding them, those are certainly core principles that need to be adhered to.
Yeah, they are. And maybe the problem is that it's about inclusion in the process. Like having women on a team.
For someone. You cannot build something for the consumer. And you kept saying this. You cannot say it's for me if I wasn't in charge. Yeah.
Absolutely. So it's just really about representation as well. So, when we're talking about happy cities, it's really also, about those underlying issues, like gender inclusion and, and safety so it's quite interesting. It's quite an interesting question that raises so many issues.
Well, Dr. Magalie Masamba, on that bombshell, I would like to say thank you very much for joining us, and certainly wishing you all the best. Let's stay in touch.
Thank you for having me. Thank you very much.